Greetings, fellow gorehounds, and welcome back to yet another edition of Blood Splattered Adaptations. This week I'll be comparing what I consider to be one of the very best horror films of the last decade to the Stephen King penned novella it's based on. So grab yourself a flashlight and hold on to that there broom handle while I venture deep into the blinding miasma in order to compare Stephen King's The Mist to Frank Darabont's big screen adaptation. Round 1. The story. After weathering through the storm of the century, wink wink nudge nudge, a father and son travel to the local grocery store to stock up on some much needed supplies, only for it to be covered in a thick haze filled with man-eating monsters. Trapped inside with nothing but the company of a religious wacko and her scared devotees, they must choose between battling the monsters outside or facing the ones within. Sounds like a badass premise, doesn't it? Well, thankfully, Mr. Darabont agreed, so there are only a few changes worth noting. The first and most noticeable being the times when the film sees fit to clarify ideas the novel left intentionally ambiguous. For example, the characters in King's version often reference the Arrowhead Project, a military operation taking place near the town, as a possible source of the mist and its creatures.
That storm, Ollie said in his soft, level voice. Maybe it knocked something loose up there. Maybe there was an accident. They could have been fooling around with anything. Some people claim they were messing with high-intensity lasers and masers. Sometimes I hear fusion power. And suppose they ripped a hole straight through into another dimension.
Now, as that brief exchange shows, while the characters do jump to conclusions regarding the source of their ills, they're still, at the end of the day, merely theories. Granted, the theories are strengthened when two boys from the military base commit suicide before anyone can ask them outright, but that's still circumstantial at best. The film, on the other hand, presents us with 3 military personnel, 2 of which commit suicide, and the third of which...
How they thought that there were other dimensions, other worlds all around us, and how they wanted to try and make a window, so they could look through and see what's on the other side.
The inclusion of this character gives a rather concrete explanation for everything, and personally, I could have done without it. And by it, I mean the explanation, not the character himself. I actually kinda dig him. But the way the novella plays out, with terrible things happening with little rhyme or reason, feels far more true to life. It's less about why things are happening and more about what they mean to you individually, or more specifically, what they mean to our protagonist. In fact, it's the lack of explanation that allows fanatical thoughts to gain a foothold, because whenever there's no answer, the fearful tend to seek a higher power for guidance. It's just unlucky for all involved, the one preaching of a higher power happens to be batshit McNuts.
It's expiation we want to think about now. We have been scourged with whips and scorpions. We have been punished for delving into secrets forbidden by God of old. We have seen the lips of the earth open. We have seen the obscenities of nightmare. The rock will not hide them. The dead tree gives no shelter. And how will it end? What will stop it?
Expiation, shouted good old Myron LaFleur. Expiation, they whispered uncertainly.
To be fair, the film does make having an explanation work in its favor, because this allows the cult's fears to be strengthened when they make science itself their enemy. This leads into another change that's less a result of the mediums and more a product of the times the two were written. Stephen King's novella was penned in 1980, coming right out of the 70s. As a result, its doomsday cult has far more in common with those of the 70s, i.e. Jonestown and the like. It's less defined by an ancient text and more by the personality of the kook running it.
The expeditions to Mrs. Carmody's antiquary shop worked well for my wife and son. She was into carnival glass and he was into death in the name of taxidermy. But I thought that the old woman exercised a rather unpleasant hold over Steph's mind, which was in all other ways practical and hard-headed. She had found Steph's vulnerable spot, a mental Achilles heel. Nor was Steph the only one in town who was fascinated by Mrs. Carmody's Gothic pronouncements and folk remedies, which were always prescribed in God's name.
Darabont's script, however, was written shortly before 2007 at the tail end of the rise of American fundamentalism, which meant his cult became ruled by the Christian Bible, and the overall story serves as a metaphor for the state of America at the time of the film's release, i.e. a culture of fear brought on by an attack by a hidden enemy.
Oh my God, David, we're a civilized society.
As long as the machines are working and you can dial 911, but you take those things away, you scare the shit out of them. No more rules.
Now, to be clear, both stories put forward the idea that there's nothing scarier than the human capacity for evil, but Darabont's version puts a much greater emphasis on it than King's original, and nowhere is that made more clear than in the following scene.
It is his fault. Yes,
No!
it is your fault.
No! It is not my fault!
You did it.
This sequence of events does not occur in the novella. In fact, the only one who actually gets harmed by the religious rhetoric is the one preaching it herself, ironically. That being said, the cult does attempt to sacrifice the protagonist's son.
It is from their number that the sacrifice must come. From their number the blood of expiation.
A rising rumble of agreement spurred her on. She was in a frenzy now. Spittle flew from her lips as she screamed at the people crowding up behind her.
It's the boy we want! Grab him! Take him! It's the boy we want!
This scene, however, is also included in the film beat for beat, but the major difference is it occurs after the one with the soldier. I actually prefer the movie's approach here because it levels out the playing field in terms of danger. We've already seen the Mist take many lives, but it isn't until we watch these people take the poor soldier's life that it becomes clear there's very little difference between the two. Plus, when the cult leader dies in the book, there's zero indication the people of the store have it in them to carry out her wishes without her. Whereas in the film, it's obvious everyone's gone way too far off the deep end. The final change worth noting is the film's ending, but I'll address that when I talk about the scares. So for now, I think it's safe to say both versions have their pros and their cons, which means round one is a tie. Round two, the characters. David Drayton is a frustrated artist, trying his damnedest to cope with being merely good in a world that only appreciates great. He's a wonderful father to Billy, his energetic son with very little characterization otherwise, and he's a loving husband to Stephanie, his sassy wife, who we don't get to see much of as she stays behind when the two head into town. Naturally, this leads into a lot of internal strife within David, who's constantly aware of the potential of his wife's death. But David and Billy don't venture into town alone. No, because they bring with them David's drunken, lecherous neighbor, Brent Norton, a big city lawyer who treats their quaint town as if it were his summer home.
Norton was a lawyer from New Jersey, and his place on Long Lake was only a summer cottage with no furnace or insulation. 2 years before, we had a boundary dispute that finally wound up in county court. I won. Norton claimed I won because he was an out-of-towner. There was no love lost between us.
For the most part, all of these dynamics make their way into Darabont's film, but with a couple differences. For one, due to the paradigm shift the art world went through over the last few decades, David's frustration has gone from being good in a world of great to being great in a world of meh. This change has less significance than others, because while it does inform the character, it has little bearing on the tale as a whole.
You kidding? They could whip up some bad Photoshop poster in an afternoon. They do it all the time. 2 big heads.
The second and far more significant change is that of the character of Brent, whose negative traits are all but removed. This naturally has a direct effect on how the audience sees him, especially in relation to his inevitable death. In the book, the character dies a slave to his own logic, and I personally couldn't help but feel a tinge of good riddance. Up until that point, he'd done nothing but make David's life miserable, eyeing his wife, cussing like a sailor in front of Billy, and layering all their interactions with what David perceives as backhanded insults. Granted, none of these crimes are worthy of death, not by a long shot, but when you're dealing with fictional characters, it is a lot harder to care about their fate if you despise everything about them.
Brent Norton spared one final glance at the tree that had crashed into our living room. Too bad it wasn't an apple tree, huh? Billy remarked brightly. That's what my mom said. Pretty funny, don't you think? Your mother's a real card, Billy, Norton said. He ruffled Billy's hair in a perfunctory way, and his eyes went to the front of Steph's t-shirt again. No, he was not a man I was ever going to be able to really like.
In the film, however, most of the early Norton interactions are cut out for obvious pacing reasons. As such, we never witness him do the things that frustrated David in the novel. We only get to see as they grow to respect one another as the movie plays on. As a result, I too found myself respecting the man, especially when it came to his practical line of thinking as the mist arrived, because most likely I would have an equally hard time believing in monsters without having seen them with my own eyes. And I would probably contemplate doing exactly what he ultimately does. I think it's important to note that while Norton's death occurs the exact same way in the novel, the way he's handled beforehand does cause a major shift in how the viewer reacts. With King's version, for example, you recognize the darkness within yourself when you realize just how glad you are the character's gone. But with Darabont's approach, your heart sinks when the rope comes back red. It's emotionally devastating because on some level you've grown to like or even relate to movie Norton. So his death has now become a tragedy.
Nothing in the mist.
What if you're wrong?
Then I guess the joke would be on me. After all.
In this particular case, however, I lean with the novella, as I find the recognition of your own evil is much more horrifying than mere tragedy. But don't you think we're done with this section just yet? One other character experiences big changes in the translation from page to screen, and that's the psychotic hell bitch herself, Miss Carmody, the one who whips the entire store into a frenzy. The original take on her can be best described as the witch in the woods, the local soothsayer with all kinds of herbal remedies for whatever woes might ail you.
Before, she'd been nothing but a mildly eccentric woman with an antique store in a town that was lousy with antique stores. Nothing but an old woman with a few stuffed animals in the back and a reputation for folk medicine. It was said she could find water with an applewood stick, that she could charm warts and sell you cream that would fade freckles to shadows of their former selves. I even heard, was it from old Bill Giosty, that Mrs. Carmody could be seen in total confidence about your love life, that if you were having the bedroom miseries, she could give you a drink that would put the ram back in your rod.
There's also a strong implication that Carmody ascribes to a much darker and older line of thinking than any modern religion. That's not to say there aren't elements of the kind of religious extremism we still see to this day, just that it rarely sounds like the God she prays to comes from any line of Judeo-Christian philosophy. In fact, at times she sounds downright Lovecraftian.
A blood sacrifice.
Blood sacrifice. The words hung there, slowly turning. Even now, when I know better, I tell myself that then what she meant was someone's pet dog. There were a couple of them trotting around the market in spite of the regulations against them. Even now, I tell myself that. She looked like some crazed remnant of New England Puritanism in the gloom, but I suspect that something deeper and darker than mere Puritanism motivated her. Puritanism had its own dark grandfather, Old Adam with bloody hands.
Darabont's take, however, hits a little closer to home. Well, at least for me it does. Here she's not a cartoon representation of archaic religions, but rather the ultimate culmination of Christian fundamentalism. She's essentially a pointed commentary on the line of thinking that spawned the Westboro Baptist Church. She's the lady in that Jesus Camp documentary decrying Harry Potter as satanic. She's a fictional representation of all those backwater pastors declaring natural disasters as God's wrath against the gays, or whatever minority they decide is evil this week.
Let me help these people. Let me shine your light. Because they're not all bad. They can't all be bad.
Needless to say, I much prefer the film's Miss Carmody over the books, because the fact of the matter is I've met the film version, and she's just as despicable as she comes across on celluloid. Every town across America has at least one, and what's even more frightening is that for a while there, it felt like there were way more than ever before. They're the ultimate false prophets, leading their sheep down the dark path of hatred and violence, all in the name of their so-called God's love. Oh, God. There's really no contest here because no other character in either the book or the movie affected me as much as Darabont's Carmody. And for that reason, round 2 goes to the film. Round 3, the storytelling. Stephen King wrote the novella in the first-person perspective from David's point of view. As such, the story's emotional core is internalized, with David's worries and uncertainties forming much of the atmosphere. Mr. King also sheds a lot of light on what scares David himself via his nightmares, which also serve the additional purpose of foreshadowing much of what is to come.
I had a dream that I saw God walking across Harrison on the far side of the lake. A God so gigantic that above the waist he was lost in the clear blue sky. In the dream, I could hear the rending crack and splinter of breaking trees as God stamped the woods into the shape of his footsteps. He was circling the lake, coming toward the Bridgeton side, toward us, and all the houses and cottages and summer places were bursting into purple-white flame like lightning, and soon the smoke covered everything. The smoke covered everything. Like a mist.
This is a rather effective approach on King's part, as with that one brief dream sequence at the tail end of the first chapter, we learn quite a lot about David that we wouldn't have otherwise. We now know that despite his outward cynicism, which some might recall from my Cujo video is more a staple of King's writing than of the character himself, David, it turns out, is a God-fearing Christian, or at least subconsciously he is. This paints his reactions to Miss Carmody in a very interesting light, because while he does reject her intellectually, obviously, somewhere deep down his greatest fear isn't what she might do, but rather that she might be right in doing it. This aspect of David's character doesn't come across at all in the film, probably because pulling off the dream sequences would have cost far more money and time than the production had. As such, the insight we get into David's fears come in the way of the dialogue, what can be shown visually, and through Thomas Jane's fantastic performance. Which means we know for a fact he worries about his wife's fate, we know he fears about the beast clawing outside, and we know he hates the vile words spewing out of Miss Carmody's maw. This is because concrete ideas like those translate far easier to the medium of film than abstract ones. But that's not to say the medium is inferior, not by a long shot, as there are a lot of things Darabont's version is able to communicate far better than King's could. For example, Darabont deliberately shot the film in a loose fashion with lots of shoulder cams and tight close-ups. This puts the camera's position at about the same level an average person's head would be, and the tight close-ups emphasize claustrophobia. This is because when a camera is super close to an actor's face, it leaves very little of what's commonly referred to as breathing room. And it's most likely referred to that way because people have a natural tendency to hold their breath and tense up when they see such tight shots. All these choices culminate in putting the audience in the scenes with the characters, making them part of the narrative rather than mere observers.
They're dead! They're all dead! Look at him!
Speaking of the characters, if there's a single praise I think King deserves above all else, it's his ability to manage the huge cast that pepper the book. In a movie, it's relatively, keyword being relatively, easy to make sure the audience knows where a character is and what they're doing. All you've got to do is use establishing shots and or make sure they're in the frame. In a book, however, you have to constantly remind the reader who's where and why, and it's a testament to King's writing that you never lose sight of anybody, especially characters like Miss Carmody, who is always lurking in the background gaining a new follower or two every time she's mentioned. Also, the fact he accomplishes this while keeping a quick, tight read is all the more amazing. The version of The Mist in my copy of The Skeleton Crew is only 130 pages, but it consists of over 20 named characters who each get more than one thing to do.
7 of us went. Ollie, Dan Miller, Mike Hatlin, Myron LaFleur's erstwhile buddy Jim, also hungover but seemingly determined to find some way to atone, Buddy Eagleton, myself. The 7th was Hilda Repler. Miller and Hatlin tried half-heartedly to talk her out of coming. She would have none of it. I didn't even try. I suspected she might be more competent than any of us, except maybe for Ollie.
Just holy shit, guys! I can't emphasize enough how hard that is to pull off, despite how easy King made it look. But that's not to say Darabont's job was too much easier, as ensemble casts have their own unique hurdles to jump through when making a movie. For one, there was a crap ton of egos trapped inside of that room for the month or two it took to shoot this thing, and it's a testament to Frank's ability as a leader that he didn't crack under the pressure. Also, kudos to him for keeping the film under budget, especially since this movie looks like it cost way more than the $18 million they put into it. To put this into perspective, Darabont's previous adaptations, The Green Mile and The Shawshank Redemption, cost $60 million and $25 million respectively. And his one theatrical non-King adaptation cost about $72 million, yet I'd argue The Mist looks about as good as any of these films, despite costing significantly less. Which reminds me, a little known fact about Darabont, he intentionally shot this film on a low budget for the sole reason that he wanted to capture the conditions his favorite horror films were made under. Those, of course, being the conditions of not having enough money nor time, and the constant looming threat of having it all fall apart at any minute. Yeah, that's right, you heard me correctly. Frank Darabont intentionally sought out insanity because he truly believed that from insanity spawns genius.
Let's embrace that tradition as well. Let's embrace the tradition of shoot it as fast as you can, shoot it as cheaply as you can.
We have a very high-tech gizmo. It's called a pallet jack, and we're ramming the set with it.
Anywho, there's one last aspect of Darabont's storytelling that I want to commend, but unfortunately, most of the world did not get to see it unless they bought the special edition DVD. You see, The Mist was originally intended to be in black and white, because Darabont wanted to capture the feel of the late 50s and mid-60s era of creature features, such as Night of the Living Dead or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Now, there are two main reasons for this, the first being that Darabont grew up watching these films on television, so whenever he sees a black and white horror film, it immediately takes him back to the headspace of the scared child, watching the movies from in between his fingers or his bed sheets. The second and more artistic reason is because quite a few of those films presented worlds of paranoia. Worlds where the main fear came not from the monsters, but rather the people around you. They presented the hypothesis that your greatest danger will not come from outside, but from within. Hell, even the more monster-centric films such as It Came From Beneath the Sea or even Gojira were all products of man's own hubris, which if you recall earlier is exactly how Darabont's version presents The Mist and its creatures. I highly suggest anyone who can afford it to see the black and white version, as while it's the only change in the director's cut, it is a huge one that affects the entire viewing experience. It is absolutely my preferred version of the movie. That being said, thus far I've talked exclusively of the theatrical cut, so the black and white edition isn't going to factor at all into my equation, which of course means round 3 is yet another tie. And finally, round 4,
the scares.
At the risk of repeating myself, The Mist is about the fear of monsters, both from the outside and within. As such, King's novella has many encounters with tentacled and insect-like beasties, not the least of which being the giant one that devours Norm the bag boy when they attempt to kick on the store's backup generators.
The tentacle came over the far lip of the concrete loading platform and grabbed Norm around the calf. My mouth dropped wide open. Ollie made a very short glottal sound of surprise. Ugh! The tentacle tapered from the thickness of a foot, the size of a grass snake, at the point where it had wrapped itself around Norm's lower leg, to the thickness of maybe 4 or 5 feet where it disappeared into the mist. It was slate gray on top, shading to a fleshy pink underneath, and there were rows of suckers on the underside. They were moving and writhing like hundreds of small puckering mouths.
Darabont brought this scene to life using a mixture of practical effects and beautiful digital artistry. Some of the very best I've seen from a horror film to this very day, in fact. And I'll say this about the translation here. While it's one thing to read about a boy being devoured by teethed tentacles, it's a whole nother thing to see it with your very own eyes. Oh, Oh, nasty stuff. The other creatures were brought to life using similar techniques with equal effect, though none quite as terrifying as the arachnids. Oh, no. It's okay, we don't need to see that part. No, I'm okay. I can do this. While it is true the book version of the arachnid scene is far simpler, its effectiveness is not lost in text because the fact of the matter is, making someone imagine spiders is about as bad, if not worse, as showing them one.
It was the size of a big dog. It was black with yellow piping, racing stripes, I thought crazily. Its eyes were reddish purple, like pomegranates. It strutted busily toward us on what might have been as many as 12 or 14 many-jointed legs.
Okay, I think that's enough of the monster shit. So let's move on to some of the other forms of horror, shall we? One of my absolute favorites would be the internal strife David faces in King's novella that doesn't show up at all in the film. It's not something that would horrify everybody, but a select few of you out there will most likely understand why I'm putting it under the scare section. To put it simply, David struggles with the vile temptress of infidelity when he starts having sexual feelings for the character of Amanda Dumfries, a woman whose own husband is out of town for work.
I was developing an uncomfortable, strong feeling for her. Uncomfortable, but not exactly unpleasant. Her eyes were an incredible, brilliant green. For a while I had kept an eye on her to see if she was going to take out a pair of contact lenses, but apparently the color was true. I wanted to make love to her. My wife was at home, maybe alive, more probably dead, alone either way, and I loved her. I wanted to get Billy and me back to her more than anything. But I also wanted to screw this lady named Amanda Dumfries.
This is something that would strictly horrify anyone in an intimate relationship. The idea that if trapped and away from the one you love, you might develop feelings for another. It's a very human fear, based in reality, as it has been known to happen. Unfortunately, in the film, the relationship between Amanda and David is strictly emotional, and while it's implied they may have intimate feelings for one another, they never act upon it. In the novella, however, they do.
In the darkness, she was nothing but a shape, and I put my arms out, touched her, and pulled her to me. She was trembling. We went down to the floor, first kneeling, kissing, and I cupped one firm breast and could feel the quick thudding of her heart through her sweatshirt.
It's a crying shame Darabont's script didn't include this scene, as I found it to be one of the more compelling and surprisingly horrifying aspects of the novella.
Love me, David. Make me warm. When she came, she dug into my back with her nails and called me by a name that wasn't even mine. I didn't mind. It made us about even.
It also comes full circle later on when David and a couple others escape the store, but the path to his house, to his wife, is blocked by fallen trees. And he doesn't dare walk the rest of the way because it's become clear the monster is attacked by scent, and the only way to keep his scent out of the air is to stay inside his car. He then has this momentary breakdown.
I began to get a tension headache. It was driving through the fog at a steady 5 or 10 miles an hour that did it. Tension of knowing that anything might come out of it. Anything at all. A washout, a land spill, or Ghidra, the three-headed monster. I think I prayed. I prayed to God that Stephanie was alive, and that he wouldn't take my adultery out on her. I prayed to God to let me get Billy to safety because he had been through so much.
It's truly powerful and haunting stuff. The fear of not knowing. Even he, after escaping the cult of the market, still finds himself turning to God in his scared state. It's this aspect of King's ending that I prefer over Darabont's, because in his version, David does discover the arachnid's god inside, and that his wife is indeed dead. It's a little less powerful knowing her fate, as it's the doubt that will really tear one up inside. Because with doubt, you'll never complete the stages of grief, and will undoubtedly come back around to the side of hope again until that gets taken away and the cycle starts all over. In that way, it's a lot like what parents in unsolved abduction cases go through, and there are few things more horrifying than that. With all that being said, however, I much prefer the rest of Darabont's ending over King's, and allow me to explain why. In the novella, the story ends with the survivors at a Howard Johnson's hotel, with David writing down everything that's happened for whomever might come across it. He then concludes his story by explaining that he found an old multiband radio, and then, at the far end of the AM band, he heard a single solitary word.
One word. If I only really heard it. If only. I'm going to bed now. But first I'm going to kiss my son and whisper 2 words in his ear. Against the dreams that may come, you know. 2 words that sound a bit alike. One of them is Hartford. The other is hope.
It's a rather hopeful ending to a horrid tale, but with a little ambiguity as to whether or not he actually heard that word, or for that matter, whether hearing the word even means anything in the long run. After all, for all he knows, the entire planet is overrun by these monsters, and every day will be a literal fight for survival against an undefeatable enemy. In total honesty, I've never cared for this ending. Not because it's a poor one, but because it feels totally out of place with the rest of the narrative. Up until this point, the whole story has been so devastating, so cruel, so matter-of-fact, that to even end on a slight glimmer of hope always felt super false to me. But then again, I've never been quite sure how I would have ended it either. It's an apocalyptic tale. There aren't many satisfactory places you can take a conclusion in that setting. Either everyone dies, a victim of the harsh new world, or they live on and continue fighting despite the odds. The first option always felt a little too easy, too clean for my tastes, and the second, which the book goes for, just doesn't ring true. This movie screamed for a bleak ending, but I could never figure out what that ending should have been. That is, until I saw the film. Allow me to set the stage. The survivors are driving through the mist with no visible end in sight. They take the car about as far as they can go, until the gas runs completely out. They can't leave the car, for that spells death, and there's no indication that getting out would do anything other than lead to more running and running and running. These people are at the absolute end of their ropes, and unfortunately for them, those ropes look like they'll be coming back red. That is when this happens. It chills me to the bone every time I watch that scene. Every performance is perfect. You can see in their eyes as they each resolve to go out on their own, less painful terms. After all, their remaining options are to either keep running and most likely face death inside some monstrosity's gullet, or stay inside and face starvation. Survival at all seems entirely unlikely at this point, and personally I would make the same choice if given the same circumstances. I mean, life's gone. Everyone you know is dead. Society has crumbled around you. What point is there to continue if the new food chain has placed you at the bottom, with zero room to climb up? So yeah, while I do prefer King's lack of answers regarding David's wife, I absolutely prefer the direction Darabont takes the ending after that. Because the one thing I can think of even more horrifying than not knowing the fate of the woman I love is making the conscious decision to take the life of my own son in order to protect him from a life more terrible than death. And I'm not ashamed to admit that this scene nearly broke me down in tears, but I was able to hold them back, not knowing that Darabont wasn't done with me yet, that he had yet another gut punch waiting in the wings.
Come on, come on! Come on! Come on!
And with that, I broke down. I cried my eyes out in the theater and did so again when I got back home. This film sports one of my absolute favorite endings to a horror movie ever, as everything about it hit me exactly as it was intended to. Every beat was as devastatingly powerful as I had always felt an ending to The Mist should be. And what's more, I found out later that the ending came completely with Stephen King's 100% approval, as he was never satisfied with the way the book concluded either. In fact, he told Darabont that his biggest challenge wouldn't be adapting the rest of the book, but rather finding a more appropriate way to end it, and by God, he did. I also love what this conclusion says about the rest of the movie, because the one person who survives and successfully saves her loved one is the person everyone refused to help because they were too afraid. It's the character who faced her fear in order to protect her child that gets to live, not those who left her to die, not those who were slaves to their own fears. Just, holy shit. It's so fucking perfect. The best part is Darabont did not pull the ending out of his ass, like some have claimed. It's actually suggested by a line in the text.
I checked the gun and put it into the glove compartment. Ollie had reloaded it after the expedition to the drugstore. The rest of the shells had disappeared with him, but that was alright. He had fired at Mrs. Carmody. He had fired once at the clawed thing, and the gun had discharged once when it hit the ground. There were 4 of us in the Scout, but if push came right down to shove, I'd find some other way to off myself.
And with that one single passage, Darabont conceived of this masterpiece. Bravo, Mr. Darabont. My hat is off to you. And here's hoping you can one day get to that much anticipated adaptation of The Longest Walk, because as far as I'm concerned, you're 3 for 3 when it comes to Stephen King adaptations.
He paid me a huge compliment. He said, wow, that's a great ending. If I had thought of that ending, I'd have used that ending when I wrote the story, which made me feel fantastic. Because pleasing Steve King is foremost in my mind when adapting him.
Now, I know there are many people out there who absolutely despise this ending, and that's perfectly fine. You're all entitled to your opinions. But personally, I can't think of many films with superior ones. This is the cream of the crop as far as horror endings are concerned, and for that reason, round 4 goes to the film. Needless to say, both versions of the story are worth everyone's time, but only the film has truly stuck with me as an important part of my own personal horror history. I will never forget watching The Mist, and the fact that on repeat viewings I still feel those feelings I did the first time is a testament to how much of a modern classic it really is. If you haven't seen it yet, please do yourself a favor and do so. And if you're a reader, definitely check out King's novella. It's a fast read, and I doubt you'll be disappointed.
Pull up a chair, deep in the crib, from a blood red chalice you must take a sip. Sit right back for a flick, see gore and entrails and slimy ink. Welcome, you gorehounds, the beating, dripping ooze. Welcome to the lair of the horror guru.
This re-upload of a classic episode of Blood Splattered Adaptations was brought to you by these amazing Blood Splattered Patrons. If you yourself would like to become a patron, click on the little button on the right so that you can help Blood Splattered Cinema get bigger and better. Like an Uber Jason who just wants his machete back.
You know, when I was a lad about your age, I started having those uncontrollable little boy erections, like little hard galvanized rubber bullets just locked and loaded in your Oshkosh bagosh. Fucking Syrian government, you want to take care of your shit? Shoot a bunch of little boy penises into the crowd. No more insurgency. Fucking done deal.
Thank you, my fellow gorehounds, for tuning in to this re-upload of a classic episode of Blood Splattered Cinema. If you liked the voiceovers of The Mist that appeared in this episode, then be sure to check out Jeremy Huffman's YouTube page, Game Gallows, where he and a good friend of his riff on shitty video games that they happen to come across and play. It's pretty awesome, and it's a whole lot of fun, so check it out, and as per usual, like, comment, subscribe. Be sure to check out my Facebook and Twitter pages, is @TheHorrorGuru, and be sure to check out my official website, www.bloodsplatteredcinema.com. And if you happen to like the theme song that has appeared at the end of, just about all my videos for the past, few months, then check out Brian Barnes' YouTube channel, where he dresses up like a skeleton and does crazy antics. He's the guy who wrote the song, and he's a pretty awesome motherfucker, so show him some love. Like, comment, subscribe on his channel. Same goes for Game Gallows. Anyway, my fellow Gorehounds, I'm gonna go re-upload some other old episodes, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace out.